Hi, my name's Angela Casey and welcome to Edinburgh Outdoors, the podcast that explores Edinburgh outdoor spaces and the people in them. I'm sitting today in Dunbars Close, which is a really lovely formal garden with some informal bits and some plants. And we are welcoming back Hetty Lancaster from Hetty's History Walks. So welcome to our second podcast, Hetty.
Oh, thank you very much for having me back.
This is a really nice garden, isn't it?
It's absolutely lovely. It is one of my favourite outdoor spaces in Edinburgh, I think. It has a lot to offer at every season. So even though we're here in November, there's still things to see.
Still quite a lot of flowers out, aren't there?
Surprising number of flowers, actually.
It's nice.
It's been quite a mild November, I think, so far. Fingers crossed.
I think we're getting a bit of building work behind us, but that's part of the inner city. I thought you just put up with it. So we're going to talk about the garden, and you've got some fascinating background about plant explorers, and we're also going to go around and have a look at some of the plants, because some of the plants here have medicinal properties, which would be interesting. So how's your business been since we last met up?
Yeah, it's been good. It's coming to the end of the year now, so it's all a bit quieter. I've finished my scheduled local history walks, still got a few private clients trickling in. Not all tourists either, actually. I get a surprising number of local people coming to do private walks. So I had a really nice one at the weekend, actually, where they were having a bit of a family celebration, and they had friends and family who had come in from other parts of the UK, and they wanted something to just fill a couple of hours in the afternoon, and that was really nice. We got lucky with the weather again, and it's I think private walking tours like that are quite a nice thing to do with a group that don't necessarily all know each other, because it's a very nice informal setting to be able to wander around and do a bit of chat with each other, but also, of course, you've got the guide to listen to, and then that also gives you something to talk about later on as well when you're at your dinner or
keep the family
whatever
talking
it
to
is.
each other.
Yeah, so I think that's quite nice, but not many tours at this time of year, if I'm honest. We all need a little bit of downtime.
We do. Though actually, November in Edinburgh has been lovely. Really nice weather. It was a bit chilly the last couple of days, but we're sitting in the sunshine again, so we can't complain.
A very mild November. I was listening to some of your podcasts. You've been doing some really interesting podcasts recently.
Yeah, I have actually been having a fascinating time. I've been finding out about the Romans on the Antonine Wall, which is a bit of a personal passion of mine, which I really enjoyed. And just in the last week, I've been walking around talking about James Hutton and geology up on Salisbury Crags. And last Monday, I was lying in a hammock in the woods drinking tea.
Oh, amazing.
And then I've also been probably illegally, climbing on some railway lines. So, yeah, I've been having a good time and enjoying it.
It's an amazing variety of things you've been finding to talk about.
It all starts to come out of the woodwork when you start poking around your city.
Yeah.
And bizarrely, this is my home and I've been here many years, and yet I'm finding out so many things that I didn't know about the city.
It is definitely the city that keeps on giving. I notice little details all the time, even in streets that I've walked down so many times, and even though I think I'm being quite observant, but yeah, there's always something that I kind of go, never noticed that before.
I walked down here the other day and I spotted these funny figures on top of a building that I didn't know you know. So it's just amazing. And this garden, of course, is a hidden gem. Well, it's lovely to be back again having another chat and sitting on your very nice insulated mats on a bench in the sun. So we're in Dunbars Close, which is on the Canongate, and it's a formal, informal garden, as I said. So can you tell me about it?
Yes, originally in the 17th century and before, Edinburgh would have had lots of gardens on its backlands. So we tend to call the foreland is the building that fronts onto the High Street or the Royal Mile, and then the backlands are that long, narrow strip of land that goes behind it. And originally these would all have been kind of gardens, or at least areas where you might have had like livestock and your vegetable garden and things like that. And then over time, the ones in Edinburgh get built up and the ones in the Canongate remain open. And if you ever get the chance to look at the wonderful bird's eye map done by James Gordon of Rothimme, dates from 1647, and you can see in the Canongate that we've got all the houses running down the main road, and then behind they've got these beautiful gardens, and you can see these knotwork patterns and these formal layouts and trees and all sorts of things. I'm not sure if they were all quite as ornate as this. They might have used a bit of artistic license, but it definitely gives you this lovely idea, and it's a huge contrast to the borough of Edinburgh, because the borough of Edinburgh and the borough of Canongate were once very separate from each other, whereas Edinburgh is completely built up on its backlands and the Canongate is much more open and less densely populated.
I'll put links to these on the intro to the podcast online so that people can go and find them.
Yeah, they're in the National Library of Scotland, which I just have an amazing set of resources, I have to say. And the other one that is worth looking at as well is also the North Prospect of the City of Edinburgh, which is done by a guy called John Slezer, who is really a kind of a military draftsman, but he does some drawings of all over Scotland, but this one obviously of the Canongate from Carlton Hill is particularly nice. And so we would be somewhere down in here in amongst these buildings, but the gardens in this picture look a little bit less formal and a little bit less intricate than the one on the Rothiemay map, but still a really nice indication of the kind of landscape that we would once have been in. So the Dunbars Close garden is not an original historic 17th century garden. This is a recreated garden. It's a modern garden that was created by a charity called the Mushroom Trust in the 1980s, and it's not an exact replica of a historical garden either, but it is very much in the spirit of, I guess, what you might say, the kind of a typical 17th century garden in Edinburgh. And so it's got quite a formal layout. It's got yew hedges and box hedges and bay to give us lovely formal hedging with different shapes, sort of topiary shapes, to give a kind of nice kind of structure to the garden.
It's very nice. I mean, so the sun has reached us here, which is lovely, but I'm guessing they would have been growing veg as well, too, would they?
Yes.
Maybe some animals,
so
which we
most
haven't got.
gardens you would have had, you probably would have had some livestock. You would have almost certainly have had your garden, so things like vegetables, but also herbal plants as well. I mean, doctors are in reasonably short supply, so you would have done a lot of home remedies and stuff like that. Also plants for things like dyeing, for, used in the brewing
dyeing.
process. Dyeing fabrics.
Sorry.
I mean, probably in dyeing as well, I guess. I don't know. But, strewing herbs for the floors and your kind of pomanders and things like that, or perfume. You would, be distilling things. People might have had workshops as well on their backlands, so a weaving shed or something. So quite a lot of different varieties, I guess. But this Dunbars Close garden is really the kind of ornamental side. It does have some culinary and herbal plants as well that we'll probably talk about
we've
a
been
little bit
looking
later.
at some. We're going to go and have a look at some of them because there are quite a few that can be used for medicinal reasons and things, though many plants can be anyway. But yeah, it's beautifully done, and it looks like it's really well maintained as well.
Very beautifully maintained by the Mushroom Trust and also the City of Edinburgh Council.
Of course, we're looking at it in November, which we should point out, and we're in the sun, but it is November, but there are still some flowers out, and I think coming here in the summer, I've been here in the summer and it's beautiful. All the trees are out and more flowers are out than there are at the moment. It's still lovely though.
Yeah, it's very nice. And one of the things that I particularly like, I mean, as a historian, one of the things that I particularly like about this garden is not just that it's in the spirit of a lovely 17th century formal garden, but by and large, all the plants in it are plants that were in Scotland in around the 17th century. So these are all plants that you would have been able to have. And the Mushroom Trust actually worked with horticultural experts and some garden historians to decide what plants to put in here. And they used some 17th century texts as well that were written in Britain, listing different plants that were around. And one in particular that's really key for Edinburgh, there was this book called, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but it's the Hortus Medicus Edinburgensis, I think.
What a fantastic sounding.
Which is a good name, isn't it? And so the Hortus Medicus Edinburgensis was written in 1685 by James Sutherland, who was the first King's botanist in Scotland. He was the first Regius keeper of a physic garden, which was established in sort of about 1670s in a different part of Edinburgh. And that garden would go on to become the Royal Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh. But Sutherland lists over 2,000 plants that they've got for medical purposes. It's for teaching medical students, essentially, that have been grown in this sort of early physic garden. He includes English names, which is really interesting, so that people who can't read Latin can also find it useful. He notes which ones can be used for medicinal purposes, and he also marks the ones that grow easily and naturally in Scotland as well. So it was a really key text, and I think it remains the key botanical text for Scotland, like up into the 18th, 19th century or something like that. So it's a massive, massive work. And so it's lovely that nearly all of the plants here in Dunbars Close garden are all from the sort of 17th and 18th century. So it's very much a kind of like historical sort of setting, I guess.
I think it's lovely that someone's done all that work, and you might not know it coming in. I mean, there is a leaflet as you come in, but a lot of people might not realise how much work has gone into it, and that's really interesting. I like that. And the fact that it goes back so far and that every plant would have been here.
Yeah. When the Mushroom Trust were developing this, it's like they actually asked the local community what kind of garden they thought they would like, and it was the local community that went, oh well, actually we're right next to the Canongate Kirk on one side, there's Adam Smith's house just on the other side, and so they felt that a historical garden would be the most appropriate and that one for everybody to enjoy. So the Mushroom Trust is a Scottish charity which supports the creation and improvement of green spaces, particularly in urban environments. They've got an emphasis on horticultural aspects, so they do things like community gardens and orchards, public parks, mostly based in the Lothians and Borders, but they also do stuff across the rest of Scotland as well, so people can apply for funding. And they have a website under the Mushroom Trust.
So you said that the Canongate was a separate borough from Edinburgh, and we know that obviously there must have been a gate across at some point. What kind of people would have lived on the Canongate?
So a very wide range of people. So the Canongate being a separate borough, it had its own trading corporations. So there would have been people like bakers and tailors and tanners and goldsmiths, apothecaries, lawyers, that type of thing. During the 16th century, so a little bit earlier than the garden is from, it was very popular with nobility because it was very close to the royal court, and the court was very big, particularly in the sort of 15th centuries and 16th century. And also the Canongate was less built up than Edinburgh, so you had room for fresh air and gardens and a little bit more space to build. So the Countess of Hume had her house at Morrie House, which is just up the street a little bit. There's Aitchison House, which was built by a goldsmith who was a king's courtier in 1633, so a little bit later. So quite a wide range, really. You would have had the whole range of your typical kind of population living in the Canongate, and not until much later does it become a more downgraded area when it gets more industrial during the Victorian era. In the 18th century it becomes home to people like Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, whose house is just next door, Robert Ferguson, the poet, whose statue is just outside the Canongate Kirk.
Oh yeah, there's that amazing statue where he looks like he's heading off to the shops or something.
Yeah. Which is, I get one of my favourite statues.
It's a really good
he's a
statue.
very personable young man. People like William Dick, who started the Dick's veterinary schools, a kind of pioneer of veterinary science, was born in the Canongate. So yeah, like a whole range of different kind of people would have been down here. And they think that the name Dunbars Close came from a man called David Dunbar, who was an Edinburgh solicitor, and he owned property here during the 18th century. So that's where you think the name comes from.
How many closes are there down the Royal Mail, do you know?
I don't know the exact number.
It's quite
I
a
know
lot.
that there is originally around about 300, and we have about 90 or so left. I don't know how they're categorising that 90. So are they counting ones that have been opened up into courts? Are they counting ones like this that have been made into gardens? I'm not entirely sure, but when you look at the older maps, like the Rothy May map, you can see that there are loads of them. And then during the 18th century, when you get things like Southbridge and Northbridge and George IV Bridge and stuff being built and everything gets developed, then they start to get taken out and changed, I guess.
Well, and covered over some of them.
Yeah, some of them are covered over,
Really
some of them
weird.
are opened up, some of them are kind of completely demolished.
These formal gardens down the Canongate, the formality is a 17th century thing, do we think? That they were like this?
Yeah, so formal gardens were definitely in vogue during the Jacobean Tudor era. And one of the reasons, I think there's probably quite a few different reasons for this, but I think one of the reasons is because there were just less plant varieties around than we have today, and far less flowering plants. So to give interest all year round, you're using things like terracing and knot gardens and sculptural shapes of topiary to create added visual interest. I think as well people were a lot more religious, and so people saw gardens as these little pieces of paradise, so you're almost trying to recreate the Garden of Eden. So I think they're a very managed, maintained, ordered space, in contrast to the 18th and 19th century when you suddenly get natural gardens and picturesque landscaping. So that's a kind of total shift in garden design. Before that you tend to have quite formal gardens, and you would use the lines of topiary to guide your view towards different vistas and maybe a fountain or a sundial and things like that.
You were talking about plant explorers. Can you explain that to me?
Yes, so Scotland had loads of really amazing plant explorers. We tend not to really think about them, like we tend to think of Scottish doctors or Scottish engineers or something that's having a massive effect on the world, but actually Scottish plant explorers and horticulturalists, generally speaking, had a massive impact. During the sort of 18th and 19th centuries, it was the thing to have a Scottish head gardener if you had a grand mansion. The head gardeners at places like Kew, the Chelsea Physic Garden, the King's Gardens down in London were Scotsmen, and they produced this whole network of Scottish gardeners who basically often employed and recommended other Scots for working in gardens. But a lot of the plant explorers specifically were Scots. Now there's a few different reasons for this. The Scottish education system meant that most boys were highly literate, and many grew up to be multi-skilled. If you're living in rural Scotland, you are quite often very multi-skilled. You might have done a bit of thatching, a bit of ditching, you could probably do some hunting, you're probably good at bartering, so you have lots of different skills to build on. People were often multilingual, so they could speak English and Gaelic, they could maybe speak a bit of French on occasions, and above all, Scots were incredibly hardy. They were very self-reliant, they were self-sufficient, they were resilient, and they tended to have really good problem-solving skills. Just one of those things that when you grow up in a sort of very rural, not isolated country, Scotland wasn't isolated, but you kind of had to rely on yourself quite a lot. So Scotsmen were particularly suited for going on plant exploring expeditions. And so lots of these men would train as gardeners. So by the 17th century, Scots were building lovely gardens around their mansion houses, and being an apprentice gardener was quite an appealing position, really, to be honest. They would train in these gardens or in the botanic gardens here at Edinburgh or in some of the plant nurseries. So there's a wonderful book all about Scottish plant explorers called Seeds of Blood and Beauty by Anne Lindsay, published by Berlin Publishers in 2008. It's a paperback, it's only about £10, but it's brilliant. It really explains why the Scots became great plant explorers, why there were so many head gardeners, and before the 1730s, new plants were coming into Britain quite intermittently and very haphazardly. But from the 1730s, individuals and institutions really start making organised searches around the world using qualified plant experts, so people like botanists, but also gardeners, also people like surgeons and doctors who of course had studied botany. And so plant exploring becomes a real thing. And Scots plant explorers get to all corners of the globe. They face journeys of tens of thousands of miles, quite often just walking or in canoes, and they could be away for years and faced incredible hardships. I mean, like, some of the stuff that these guys face were just incredible. Some of the examples of things that happen to some of these men are they get taken captive in Afghanistan, they get attacked by Chinese pirates, they're challenged to duels by Canadian fur trappers, they face exhaustion, starvation, cold, disease. I mean, the things that they went through to bring back plants are just, I mean, it's insane, some of the things that they went through.
Is that all in the book?
Yeah, like, it's a really interesting book. I mean, there are other books as well about plant explorers in Britain and around the world. There's obviously other people as well, but this one specifically focuses on Scottish plant explorers. And it also suggests that actually Scottish plant explorers were particularly prolific. More plants are brought back to Europe by Scottish plant explorers than nearly all the other European plant explorers put together. And they go all over the world. So they go to South Africa and the Azores and the Canaries and the States and New Zealand, China, Japan, and bring back stuff that is really common in our gardens. So wisteria, that was brought back by a Scottish plant explorer. That's brought back by Robert Fortune. Robert Fortune particularly goes to China and Japan, so he brings back things like camellias, Japanese anemones, which I've got in my garden. Yeah, the wisteria, Mahonia japonica, so lots of things that are really familiar to people. And he is like the Indiana Jones of plant explorers. So China is a very closed country to foreigners at that time. Foreigners really aren't supposed to travel more than a day from any port. They're not supposed to be getting into the interior or anything like this. He learns Mandarin and disguises himself as a Chinese official and basically like wanders around and somehow manages to get away with it.
Wow.
And his books are all full of things like, you know, on the first night, everything got stolen from me apart from my gun, which was underneath my pillow. I mean, he's quite a character, Robert Fortune. He's the person who actually basically starts the Indian tea plantations being such a success, which is why we turned into a nation of tea drinkers. So he's got a whole huge... So, I mean, I don't know why they haven't made a film of Robert Fortune yet, if I'm absolutely honest. He's an incredible person. Francis Masson is one of the earlier ones. He was in the 18th century. He goes to South Africa and he brings back things like the birds of paradise plant, the red hot pokers, amaryllis, gardenias.
Think of them as classic garden plants, don't we?
Yeah, and they were incredibly exotic specimens when they first arrived, and people went to great lengths to treat their plants beautifully. And it was a real thing amongst the wealthy or people who were particularly interested in plants to have the latest specimens, and they would spend thousands of pounds on hot houses to look after their orchids.
It's interesting because obviously the Victorians loved an arboretum and planted all these interesting specimen trees, which we've still got. But I hadn't realised that it was going on earlier than that. And I knew about the apothecary side to it, but interesting that I didn't realise they were going all around the world to find.
Yeah, well, I suppose that was the beginning. You know, that was bringing them back. And when they first bring them back, not very many people have these plants. So, like, although they're in Dunbars Close garden now, they probably wouldn't have been in most people's gardens in the 17th century. It takes 100 and 200 years, like say, to the Victorian period, really for it to become within the realm of ordinary people to have these amazing plants around.
I'm rereading a really brilliant book at the moment, which came out a few years ago by Sarah Sheridan, called The Fair Botanists. Have you read that?
I have read that. I really enjoyed that.
I love that book. So I'm just rereading it because I really love it. And it's about when they moved the botanics from Leith Walk down to Inverleith House, and that they literally put the trees on these carts and carried them down. It is a brilliant book.
So, yeah, so it's the very early physic garden that James Sutherland I was mentioning earlier on. So when he had the physic garden, it would have been very close to here, actually, just down below us, near where the train station now is. Then it moved to Leith Walk, and then in the Fair Botanist starts with the move from Leith Walk to Inverleith, where it is today. Some of the plant explorers that I really like are, there's Archibald Minges, who's from 1754 to 1842. He's the person who is thought to have brought back the monkey puzzle tree from Chile. And one of my other favourites is a guy called David Douglas, who was 1799 to 1834, who dies tragically young, I have to say. He's actually one of the most prolific plant explorers. He died at 35 by falling into a wild cattle pit in Hawaii. A very ignominious end for such a great man, but he's hugely prolific. So just in California he collects 500 new species. I think some of these are probably different grasses, which I think to the average eye would probably look quite similar, and mosses. He particularly was very keen on mosses as well, but he did do lots of really interesting plants that we would recognise today. So we went to British Columbia. He was quite intrepid. He had a pet eagle which rode on his shoulder, which would be quite fun.
Oh, I think I'd be quite scared.
It sounds quite scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, could take your ear off quite easily.
That's quite a big thing to have on your shoulder.
But he's the guy who gives his name to the Douglas firs. So that's that Douglas.
I have heard that there are other gardens as you go down the Royal Mile. Is that right? That there are other gardens you can visit?
There are a few other gardens. There's nothing quite like this. I would say this is pretty much unique. I suppose the one that is closest to this would be the recreated Physic Garden down at the Palace. So on the Abbey Strand, it's known as the Abbey Physic Garden. So there's a little public garden there, and they basically remodelled it about 10 years ago, and they've recreated Physic Garden, because that's where the original Physic Garden was when they started Edinburgh's Physic Garden in the 1670s, which became the Royal Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh. And so that's where they had their first one. It outgrew that space within about 6 years.
So we're walking along. There's a very lovely long herbaceous border. Obviously it's November, so it's not quite so colourful as it probably is the rest of the time. This is lovely, this wispy thing. That's the sea holly, isn't
So
it?
yeah, I think that's a kind of the dried sea holly heads. There's a little old nasturtium flower in there. Got some mallow.
Well, mallow is the one, I think there are hollyhocks somewhere as well. Mallow is one which I was reading is very good for soothing things and allegedly can ease the pain of childbirth.
Lovely yellow thing here is evening primrose, I think, which is brought back by one of our Scottish plant explorers featured in that book, who's John Fraser.
Well, he brought it back and that's used widely in lots of things, isn't it?
Yes.
Here's the medlar tree, which is a lovely shape. I'm going up some steps now. There's some very nice trees here.
Yeah, they're really lovely. So we've got this lovely shaped yews and box.
And what's this one in the corner? You were talking about this
That's a
before.
strawberry tree. It's got these amazing fruits. In a month or so, these will all be bright orangey red. They'll look like little mini oranges or lychees. I was so surprised when I saw this for the first time the other year, and I was just had to go and look it up. It was so unusual to find something with leaves and fruit, such bright fruits, in December, which is when I first noticed it.
So we've got some more plants in here.
Yeah, sweet peas, which I understand are a cultivar from the sort of 17th century. I do love sweet peas. And I think those yellow ones are
That's
Rudbeckias.
Rudbeckia or
Yeah,
coneflower, which is related to Echinacea.
Right.
So again, that's something people take for immunity and to fend off colds and things like
yeah.
that.
So that was brought back, or one of the Rudbeckias is brought back by Thomas Drummond, who also brings back delphiniums as well, actually, and lots of other things as well. But yeah, and these lovely pyramids, sort of sculptural pyramid in the centre, a bay, which of course is a very common garden herb. There's quite a lot of different garden herbs in here. I think behind us there's things like oregano and sage and lemon balm and.
The lemon balm smells really nice. Sage, you can make a tea with it if you've got a cough or a sore throat. I have tried it, but it tastes very sickly.
Yes,
What's
so
it
sage is
particularly
antifungal and antiseptic.
Hollyhocks do lots of things. Hollyhocks are one of the ones that have got leaves that you can put on if you've got a bee or a wasp sting.
Oh, right, okay. Behind us as well, we've got these beautiful bright yellow flowers on bare stems, and these are winter jasmine. And so this completely transformed European gardens after Robert Fortune brought it back. Intrepid Robert Fortune. So
That's
they're
great. He's
beautiful.
found a lot of it, hasn't he?
Yeah, he did do loads. So he does everything like camellias and Japanese anemones and wisteria and the bleeding heart plant as well,
Oh, yeah.
the Dicentra spectabilis. So
We've got some figs. There are
so
no figs at the moment.
yeah.
Oh no,
so-
there's one fig.
I mean, I can't imagine that they ever are going to ripen outside in Scotland. I'm sure when they were growing it in actual gardens, they would have had more chance of getting them to be ripe. The fruit has really strong antiseptic properties, so people could make a poultice of dried figs, so maybe you didn't even need them to ripen, I don't know. But yeah, you could dry them and powder them, and you could make a poultice for skin ulcers and stuff like that. But we've got little things like tickweed here, which, as the name might suggest, you can use against ticks. And you kind of like maybe dried it and would put it in sort of in amongst your bedding, and maybe in part of those kind of strewing herbs that you would put on the floor or hang up over the window. So lemon balm was known as the elixir of life back in the day. It's a really ancient herb that's been known since way back into the Roman era. But it was also thought to strengthen the brain, relieve a languishing nature, so it would give you a little bit of a boost. And apparently if you drink it as a tea every morning, that will prolong your life, will see you into an old age. It's also known, just in case it's useful for you to know this, it removes flatulent spasms. They always put it in such a nice way, don't they, these old books?
Do you know what I found? That the ancient Greeks used to sniff rosemary before they sat an exam.
It is one of those stimulating smells.
And it's still a Greek tradition to sniff rosemary before you sit an exam. Allegedly.
I mean, again, that's also antiseptic as well, I think. There's, like you said, have like a rosemary gargle and things. Yarrow is also a super useful plant, so that helps to staunch blood flow. You can put a poultice of leaves onto cuts, to use it on chapped skin, and yarrow is really useful because it intensifies the medicinal properties of other plants, so it gives other plants a bit of a boost, which is quite nice. And apparently yarrow and elderflower tea, great for hangovers.
Ah. Well, it's nice to be useful to our listeners, to tell them something they didn't know. So we'll
just in case they have hangovers and are a bit flatulent.
Catmint, which is something that you know is a fairly common plant, that's supposed to be anti-inflammatory and is good for arthritis.
Oh, right. I didn't realise that. Yeah, it's certainly rich in vitamin C, and you can use it as a tea to ward off coughs and colds.
So all I was going to ask you today was, have you been anywhere new or particularly brilliant outdoors recently that you've enjoyed?
I did discover, well, I kind of knew it was there, but I hadn't been back for a long time. There's a tiny little garden just off Princess Street that most people probably don't know about, and it's called the Archivist's Garden, and it is just behind General Register House, which is that lovely big building at the end of North Bridge, almost opposite the Balmoral Hotel. And just round behind there's a tiny little archivist's garden which has some really interesting plants in it and some nice landscaping. I mean, it's tiny. It's much smaller than even Dunbars Close garden that we're in today, but it is very nice. And I was there the other day, and they had the most amazing collection of rosemary beetles, which I had to look up because I didn't know what they were. And they've got these beautiful little brown and green shiny stripes all over them. But yeah, it's a really nice little quiet spot just off Princess Street.
So we've talked quite a lot today about some books, and we've also mentioned websites where people can find out more. So I'll put all those, like the Mushroom Trust and the National Library and some of the book titles, I'll put those onto the blurb that goes with the podcast so that people can find out more. And also I'll put a Google Maps link to this garden so people can find it. So thank you very much, Hetty. Another really enjoyable podcast. Thank you very much. I love all your knowledge. You're teaching me so much.
No, thank you very much for having me. It's really nice. It's what a lovely excuse to come and sit outside and chat history in a nice surrounding, to be honest. So no, thank you very much. It's really lovely.
And we'll look forward to talking to you next time. If you've enjoyed the Edinburgh Outdoors podcast, please rate us on your podcast app and leave a review. And don't forget to tell your friends and colleagues about it too. If you know of an outdoor space in or around Edinburgh that might like to be featured, you can get in touch by email, Instagram or TikTok.